Welcome back to the panel discussion, Enhancing Federal Network Visibility and Analytics, sponsored by RSA on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. My guests today are William Muirk, Program Director of Cyber Intrusion Investigations at the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, Stephen Hernandez, Chief Information Security Officer, Acting Chief Technology Officer, and Director of Information Assurance for the Office of Inspector General at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Frank Konechny, Chief Technology Officer with the U.S. Air Force, and Zulfikar Ramzan, Chief Technology Officer at the RSA. I'm your moderator, John Gilroy, and the way I prepare for radio shows and panel discussions is I have my little secret sources. And so I tempt them with breakfast. And last week I sat down with my secret source, and this young man had a beard and T-shirt, and he looked like a bum. And he ate a lot of bacon. And I said, well, I got these smart guys in the room. I got to come up with a good question. And he said, good luck, more bacon. And I said, what would be a good question to talk about as far as the visibility of the network? He said, well, John, it's pretty obvious. I go, what's so obvious? Well, to him it was really obvious. He talked about network traffic. He said, what percentage of a network traffic is encrypted? 60 to 70%. If you want visibility on a network like that, you can have visibility on encrypted traffic. How good is that? So Bill, what do you think about this encryption? Big problem? 67%? Is that high?
That's a big problem. I wouldn't say that. I mean, if we didn't have encryption, especially the advance in point-to-point, we wouldn't have pretty much the internet economy, with the online economy we have today. From an investigative point of view, law enforcement, it can be the bane of investigation. There's nothing worse than to say, oh, yeah, well, what'd they take? I don't know. It was encrypted. But they took a lot of it. Yeah. we know they got a lot of something that was encrypted. And there are, and that's just one aspect. There's internal screening that's going on, for example, for insider threat and so on. And there are, as everyone knows, there are methodologies for internal decryption for the purpose of doing screening. But then at any point that you open up or decrypt, you are creating a vulnerability, and you've created a vulnerable point. If you remember, the very end of last year, Juniper Networks self-disclosed they had an issue with some of their firewall decryption that would enable a hacker to compromise VPN decryption. So you actually created a weakness in an attempt to make something more secure. I think encryption, it's like almost everything on the internet information age. It's a dual use and it's a value neutral. It doesn't care what it's used for. It can be used for good or bad. It's a thing. It's not a person. And it's all for us to view how we use it. And like I say, from the investigative standpoint, it's troubling. You saw what happened with Apple and desire for law enforcement to get things encrypted there. And that was encryption at rest. That's its own sort of bag of worms to deal with. To an extent, though, within government, and we've all seen this, there's mandates now that within government, if you're going to carry government data with you, it's going to be encrypted. It's going to be in-place encryption. And we do that in our investigations on the evidence we collect. And there's a certain value to that, there's no doubt. So if it falls in the wrong hands, and it's also protected. But it does cut in two directions. It's you just really wish, once in a while when you're running an investigation, you wish they go, you know what, we didn't encrypt that stream. And unfortunately, you almost never see that. And you're like, well, you found that. I wish I could find someone who was a little sloppier on the encryption because I get some evidence. But so it cuts in both directions. But I mean, in the end, I think overall the government's taking the position it's a good thing because again, without it, what we call the internet economy or exchange of ideas just wouldn't exist today. It'd be impossible to have any sort of confidentiality, integrity, or availability of data out there.
Zulfikar, from your perspective, you've seen a lot of commercial incidents and federal incidents. Where does RSA think about visibility and encrypted network traffic?
Sure. So I think on the baseline, first of all, from the perspective of encryption, we're obviously big fans of encryption at a fundamental level. We think it's a good way to retain a certain level of privacy, and I think end-to-end encryption generally makes things more secure versus anything else. From the perspective of visibility, there's two things to consider. First of all, we're kind of fortunate in that even though the vast majority of internet traffic now is encrypted, the vast majority of malicious traffic tends to not be encrypted, which is kind of good for us for now. Obviously, the bad guys will figure this out at some point and make the requisite changes. And at that point, I say, look, the reality is that visibility is not just about the network. There's a whole slew of technologies for doing endpoint visibility and being able to understand what's happening at the endpoint level. And if you have the requisite visibility at the endpoint, it turns out you can look at what's happening and continue to operate effectively even in the presence of encrypted data, because at some point, that data does get encrypted at the endpoint. You can look at what's happening prior to that point. You can gather other relevant metadata around the transaction. And in many situations, the metadata is enough to give you what you need. And then the last mile, the last bit, so to speak, is how do you get past that encrypted barrier, which again is something you can do at the endpoint level. And so from my perspective, as we start to see more and more attackers employ encryption at the network level, I would hope that our customers start to realize they need to do more and more at the endpoint level. And the reality is that endpoint is endpoint. It's not an easy thing to deploy. As we know, we've talked about complex organizations, government departments, and whatnot. People don't even know where all the endpoints are, let alone being able to secure them. But I think once these stakes rise up enough, we'll force ourselves to say, look, we have to bite that bullet and say, even though it's difficult to do, it's the right thing, and it's the only thing we can do to help protect ourselves against the kind of threat actors we're seeing out there.
So, Frank, from the Air Force perspective, visibility on network, encrypted, non-encrypted, any insights?
Well, obviously, we encrypt almost everything. I think I'm probably close to 100%, if not 100%, within the Air Force domain right now, because you have to. Now, the question becomes, when do you decrypt to look at everything else?
Let down the guard.
And we do it at the application level or at the endpoint level, user endpoint level. So we don't like decrypting in the middle, because that is just as another a factor of problem area, for incident reporting and denial of service and everything else. So the issue it becomes is, as we progress down the path of doing this, we're pushing it back in front. Now people like to get some session cookies and everything else, as they go. But still, that's not enough, because we want to really say, okay, every time you put a man in the middle there, especially when you decrypt, you have a problem space. And therefore, you want to make sure that if you're going to decrypt, it's going to be at the application level or at the endpoint, which is the user level. And that's the way we're trying to play it right now. You'll find some components don't believe that. They want to decrypt and encrypt everything all the time. Besides doing that, you have to have large amounts of processing capability. You also have a large delay factor that you will introduce into the mission. And so there's a way between, let's look at the mission as opposed to weighing against the security that you want to have or visibility you want to have. And a lot of times we're going to have to go back to the mission side, because the mission is essential. And, I'll talk to some of the operators and some of the commanders out there, and they'll basically tell you that they don't care if the data is encrypted or not, as long as they get their mission done. That's all they're concerned about, right? And, and when lives are at stake, we basically all agree with that.
So, Stephen, from your perspective, 60 to 7% encrypted, high, low, is it 100% like in the Air Force? I don't think so. There's just too much stuff at the HHS.
Yeah, we have it's actually very high. HHS has done quite a nice job throughout the past 2 decades of modernizing its network, and especially on the layer 3 type encryption. It's up there. However, we were issued with that same challenge of we've seen the encrypted exfiltration at the network layer. We've seen the enemy drop agents on our endpoints, encrypt, and then ship out. In fact, ransomware, what a great example of encryption being turned against us. First, I'll encrypt your sensitive files for ransom, then I'll do your whole machine, then I'll start extracting that data, and then I'll start deleting it if you don't pay my ransom. And they used your hardware, your software. All they did was take the key and hold it in their server. Unbelievable. And so we've, much to Frank's approach, we really focus on that endpoint protection. Not only, at some point that endpoint probably had to handle keys or certificates to do that job, to get that encryption in place. That's very helpful for us. But also for anything that we run, that's where we want the encryption to really take place, because I guarantee you at some point that magical network encryption box you have is going to fail, or a network engineer is going to make a mistake and going to route around it, or your cloud provider is going to make a mistake, and all of a sudden your information's in the public network. And so as a custodian of the data at that application layer, sometimes at that session layer, that's where we really focus our efforts.
Zulfikar, there's a popular TV show, NCIS, you talk about forensics, okay? There's a concept in security called endpoint forensics. Maybe you can define that and tell us what that all means.
Right, so I think there's been kind of different levels of endpoint forensics historically, but to me, endpoint forensics really boils down to, can I figure out what happened at the endpoint that might have led up to an interesting incident? Now, the way we've done this historically is we've gone in after the fact, and that's the worst time to go in, because there's a good chance that your typical attackers have, and by that, quite frankly, it's too late, because the good attackers have either cleaned up their tracks intentionally or unintentionally, and it's hard to figure out what's going on. It's like walking to the scene of the crime after the fact and saying, okay, I see some footprints here, tell me what happened, and trying to extrapolate from that. But if you take a step back and say, imagine you had a security camera on the scene. All of a sudden, what used to be guesswork in forensics becomes a lot easier to do. Now you're not relying on the size of the footprint to figure out what the perpetrator looked like. You can look at the camera footage and say, okay, he's about 6'2", heavy set, so on and so forth. You can actually form a much more accurate picture. And so for me, I think what we've got to do in the realm of endpoint forensics are more security cameras and fewer after-the-fact investigations. And that's only something you can start to do if you have that mindset that, hey, things are going to go wrong. Despite your best intentions, despite every tool you put in place, if you are a big enough target, if you have information that's got high density of value, which all of us in this table have, somebody is going to go after that information, and they're going to get to it at some level, or they'll get to the position where they could have accessed it. And that's where you have to absolutely know, did they get to it or not? And in the absence of knowing that information, if you have uncertainty, you've got to assume that they've gotten to it, and now it's a lot more work. But if you can have that security camera to say, you know what, they came close, but they didn't get to the right level, they didn't get that key piece of information, that changes the entire nature of the investigation. I think it's a cost that nowadays we cannot afford to not do anymore. We've got to absolutely have that level of endpoint visibility and then use that as a way to make forensics a lot easier. I don't think someone should have a PhD in forensics, and so I think we should be able to make this a much simpler process because anybody can look at security camera footage and figure it out. It requires a very expensive forensic investigator to come in and figure this out without a security camera. Yeah. And that's how I look at it. That's the great equalizer from my perspective. So to the extent that we can have endpoint security cameras, I think it'll change the game in security.
You know, Bill, the Washington Redskins just drafted a bunch of players. And the theme, by the way, is that we're just drafting football players out there. And perhaps they were using user behavioral analytics on the football players because they weren't, looking at numbers. They were looking at some amorphous characteristic. Well, he's a football player. Well, can you describe? Well, we just know. And so how does this term user behavioral analytics apply to visibility and networks?
Well, I think after all said and done, the key word there is behavioral, right? I think we've all up here and talked, and you hear everyone talk about the issues facing us today, but what's the commonality? We don't all say this technology, this thing, this item, this hardware. In the end, it's behavioral. In the end, it's people will always be the weakest link at any level. They will always be that what we have to key on. Unfortunately, we forget about that. And I think behavioral analytics is an attempt to get us back to the idea of looking at how people behave, in the simplest sense, but how we can use that in both the predictive sense and frankly, in my viewpoint as investigator, as Ulfigar alluded to, oftentimes we come in, it's kind of too late. But there are behavioral factors you can use to analyze bad guy activity and try and create a behavioral fingerprint of a human being. And you saw, like I say, you saw this in Silence of the Lambs, you see this in NCIS, you see it all. I wish it was that simple. In the digital age, it's not nearly as simple. As they say on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And so it's much more difficult to put that together. I think it's probably getting us the closest thing we can in the investigative world to where we want to be is putting a body behind a keyboard and getting that person aspect, because you can't arrest a computer, you can't indict a computer, you can't do those things to a computer. But this brought up what we mentioned before. You need forward-thinking people, because now you're talking about a psychologist with some knowledge of the way the internet works, at least a basic rudimentary knowledge of that, how people behave, how criminals as a whole behave, how fraud criminals behave as opposed to a serial killer, and putting that together. It's an incredibly powerful thing looking forward. It's awfully interesting, and I wish, gosh, I had all the PhDs it took to do that. But behavioral analytics, I think it's a big word, or a lot of big words to say. How do we look at how people behave, and how can we use that to either be more secure, to catch them, or even identify them ahead of time, which is kind of Minority Report in the way it sounds, but in the ideal world. And I think especially in the insider threat environment, which in DoD is a huge concern, there's a lot of application for this going forward.
Frank, a few years ago, I would take all these tests, the A+ and CS, all these A, B, C, D, and that was a fun adventure there. And so I had to learn about firewalls. And so I learned all the ports and all that stuff, and you check in all that silly stuff. Now there's something called a Nextgen firewall. So what's the Nextgen? Is it artificial intelligence in a firewall? Will they open and close ports at will? So what is a Nextgen firewall? Does this fit in the discussion? AI is what I think it is.
No, it's not AI. If it was, it'd be kind of interesting if it was. Yeah. It does have some extra features. It has some tagging capabilities, so we can monitor some of the applications and know what's going on. We can throttle back applications and things like that. So yes, it's one of the factors that we utilize. But again, it's only a piece of the puzzle. It is not the entire piece. And as we've learned already, that you have to pinpoint tools and techniques for particular vulnerabilities that you have in your network and in the application side, data side. And so that's why we have a collection of tools right now. I mean, it's just not, one tool does not do everything. If it did, I think we'd all buy it and that would be it.
We'd be on TV too.
Right, right.
3 easy payments of $39.95.
That's right. You know, and it's like with, you know, with the visibility issue too. You know, we've talked about, insider threat visibility and things like that. You know, we also want some of the tools to tell us, you know, some of the transaction flows that are going on for particular people. But we also run the risk at the same time, and especially in the Air Force, where a person today may be not doing any searching, and maybe the XO for the general, and all of a sudden they have to prepare for Congress tomorrow and the next day, and all of a sudden they're searching everything, everywhere. And that would cause an immediate say, this guy is actually, you know.
His behavior changed.
And so he's a problem child. And so, you know, we have to be very careful of that. So you have to categorize people. And so we want the tool sets to actually tell us things based upon flow of events. And so you're doing a time correlation now between transactions and events that are occurring in the world as opposed to anything else. And that's where it gets really messy. You just can't easily do that now, no matter what tool you have.
30 seconds quick, Zulfikar. Is RSA going to come up with AI firewalls or a little robot in there?
I think that's the wrong place for AI to be used. I think when you have a next generation firewall, all you've done is build a slightly bigger wall, and we know attackers will get around it. But we actually have been doing artificial intelligence, machine learning for years. We've been doing it for the banks successfully. We've taken a lot of that technology and now put it as part of our core security analytics offering to enable us to understand the insider threat, to look at user behavior, to find anomalies. The key to making this successful, though, is not about the AI, it's about the data. If you've got good data coming in, you can make good decisions. If you've got bad data, it doesn't matter how fancy your AI is and how many PhDs you have, you can't glean meaningful insights. And so we've really focused on getting that level of visibility from the endpoint to the network to the cloud, bringing that together, and then running analytics on top of that using machine learning techniques and AI techniques so we can glean those meaningful insights and they can ultimately be acted upon with the right context to be understood. And that, to me, is the winning combination.
I like to end on a winning combination. Better than a losing combination, isn't it? I'd like to thank my guest today, William Urich, Program Director of Cyber Intrusion Investigations at the Defense Criminal Investigation Service, Stephen Hernandez, Chief Information Security Officer, Acting Chief Technology Officer, and Director of Information Assurance for the Office of the Inspector General at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Frank Konecki, Chief Technology Officer of the U.S. Air Force, and Zulfikar Ramzan, Chief Technology Officer at RSA. I'm John Gilroy, host of Federal Tech Talk on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsradio.com and search In Focus.